everyone. I'm Chris Stover from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, or CCEPA, and on behalf of our founding partners, the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. We appreciate that you've taken the time to come out and listen to our discussion tonight. 4 groups have come together to bring you tonight's event aside from CCEPA, and they are the Situating Science, SSHRC-funded National Cluster for the Humanities and Social Studies of Science, Novel Tech Ethics, and the Canadian Business Ethics Research Network, or CBERN. I would ask you now to help me give a warm welcome to Costas Halavrezos.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good evening, and thank you for coming out to hear and to take part in this discussion of market influence on health research in Canada. You know, I've tried, but I can't think of a single aspect of health in Canada that doesn't present some kind of knot of public and private interests. For a few minutes yesterday, I thought I really did. It involved the widely accepted notion that walking provides health benefits, from improved cardiovascular performance to the boosting of vitamin D levels by venturing outdoors and into the light every day. What health-related activity could be more disconnected from commercial interests than going out for a walk? Then, unfortunately, I started thinking. Here's the knot. Should you walk with or without shoes? It's a serious question. There's a 2006 study which shows that walking barefoot decreases loading on the lower extremity joints in osteoarthritis of the knees. And a more recent Harvard study shows that people who run barefoot tend to avoid the heel-striking gait that leads to common running-related injuries. Good argument for walking and running barefoot. But despite these medical studies, I suspect that footwear manufacturers have rather strong health-related arguments for walking or running with their products, because their shoes protect your feet from the cuts and abrasions, which make you vulnerable to infections and parasites. So, after that brief interlude yesterday, I returned to the premise of this discussion, that health, and in particular health research, does contain a knot of interests. And since health research involves all of us, there's a necessary role for thoughtful inquiry into how the strands of the public and the private are woven and where, in some cases, they need to be separated. Right now, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. Francoise Baylis is Professor and Canada Research Chair in Bioethics and Philosophy at Dalhousie University and founder of the Novel Tech Ethics Research Team. She's an elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. Professor Baylis's current research interests are in novel technologies, assisted human reproduction, research involving women, stem cell research, women's health, public health ethics, neuroethics, and feminist ethics. Her research is supported by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Canada Research Chairs Program, the Canada Foundation for Innovation, and the Nova Scotia Health Research Foundation. Chris MacDonald is Associate Professor in the Philosophy Department at St. Mary's University and Coordinator of St. Mary's MA program in Philosophy. He's also a non-resident Senior Fellow at Duke University's Keenan Institute for Ethics. Named one of the 100 most influential people in business ethics for both 2008 and 2009 by Ethisphere magazine, Professor MacDonald conducts research in business and professional ethics, healthcare ethics, and foundational issues in moral theory. Professor MacDonald's scholarly work has been supported by grants from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. He's a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Business Ethics. He also writes a popular blog, which is called simply the Business Ethics Blog, www.businessethics.ca/blog. Donald Weaver is a professor in the departments of medicine, neurology, and chemistry, and the School of Biomedical Engineering at Dalhousie University. He's also a Canada Research Chair in Clinical Neuroscience and a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada in Neurology. Professor Weaver's research program focuses on 3 disease states: epilepsy, Alzheimer's disease, and bacterial infections. Some of this research consists of the design and synthesis of novel drugs for the treatment of epilepsy and Alzheimer's dementia. Co-founder of 3 drug companies, Professor Weaver has received substantial funding from the Canada Foundation for Innovation, the Atlantic Innovation Fund, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. In 2007, he received the prestigious Max Forman Research Award, presented annually by the Dalhousie Medical Research Foundation, and one of 2 coveted Centennial Awards granted by Maryland-based Alzheimer's Disease Research, or ADR. Finally, our 4th panelist, Jocelyn Downie, holds a Canadian Research Chair in Health Law and Policy. She is also a professor in the Faculties of Law and Medicine. Professor Downie has published numerous books and articles, including Dying Justice, which was winner of the 2005 Abby Ann Lynch Medal in Bioethics from the Royal Society of Canada. Her most recent writing projects include papers on barriers to access to abortion in Canada, various aspects of the law as it relates to organ and tissue donation and transplantation, assisted death at the Supreme Court of Canada, and barriers to mandatory legal ethics education in Canadian law schools, as well as health law at the Supreme Court of Canada and the 3rd edition of Canadian Health Law and Policy. Professor Downie has been the principal investigator on numerous research projects, including a training program in health and law policy funded by CIHR, and she's currently responsible for a substantial CIHR grant in neuroethics. Now the rules. Each panelist will make an opening statement of 5 minutes. I have a watch which keeps excellent time, and they will be slaves to the minute hand. Those opening remarks should make it absolutely clear what they believe to be the implications of pharmaceutical industry influence from the laboratory to the marketplace. Following that, they'll each have 3 minutes to pick up on some salient point or theme that emerged in the opening remarks. And then, just in case we've drifted off course, I'll pose a focus question. Each panelist will have 3 minutes to answer and 2 more minutes to respond to co-panelists, and then I'd like to invite audience members to ask a question before we move on to the next focus question. We may never move on to another focus question if you have lots of questions or comments yourself. We will open the floor to those of you in the audience who feel some important point may have been missed and who'd like to remedy that with a brief, concise comment or question. And I would invite you to, since we would like to get as many people from the audience to pose those questions or make comments, to perhaps refrain from launching into a manifesto and keeping those points as concise as possible so we can get a response from the panelists. This evening's discussion, as Chris mentioned earlier, is being recorded, and we will be playing back excerpts on Maritime Noon over the next few weeks. Right now, we'd like to begin with the first of our panelists, Francoise Baylis. Take it away.
Thank you. I offered to be the first to speak because I thought it would be important to put tonight's discussion in a little bit of a historical context, and so, in effect, answer the question, why are we here? And one of the things that I think is important to appreciate is, at least from the perspective of some of us, we're here because of a relatively recent event that precipitated an interest in an important question, which is what is the relationship, or what ought to be the relationship, between industry and the university or academia. And for those of you who are not aware, I'll just mention that what happened recently is that the federal government decided, in its wisdom, to appoint Dr. Bernard Prigent to the governing council of CIHR. And Dr. Prigent works for Pfizer. He's the VP. He's also a registered lobbyist. And CIHR is the organization which funds research in this country using your tax dollars. But I think the thing that's important to appreciate is that despite this event, what we're really talking about is something that has been of concern to academics for at least 10 years. And I don't doubt that it's actually been of concern much longer before that. But if you will, about 10 years ago is when I feel like I entered the fray and attempted to make a contribution to this debate And I elected to read a very short passage, the opening remarks from a paper that I published with a number of authors, as I said, 10 years ago, because I could have written the same thing today. So the opening remarks from that article read as follows. Universities have long been involved in the creation and evaluation of pharmaceutical products. In its best form, academic participation in drug-related science both spurs innovation and, through the disinterest and skepticism that are the hallmarks of the academic mission, it provides a check on the premature enthusiasm of industry. The duty of universities is to seek truth. The duty of pharmaceutical companies is to make money for their shareholders. Drug companies that fail to do so go out of business, and universities that subordinate the disinterested search for truth to other ends lose credibility and their claim to a privileged status in society. If either abandons its fundamental mission, it ultimately fails. At times, institutional imperatives are bound to conflict. And that's my concern here tonight. It's the issue of conflict of interest between those who have a clear obligation to their shareholders and those who have a clear obligation to the public interest. Having said that, I want to make my own interests perfectly clear at the beginning. I'm deeply committed to promoting and safeguarding the public interest, which I understand to be that which benefits all of us, and not merely a subsection of society, or necessarily even the majority. Second of all, I'm deeply committed to promoting the intellectual integrity of the university, and I worry that at times it's under threat. And last of all, I think it's really important to foster public trust, and I don't think you can do that without paying attention to who the master is. Having said all of that, a few little remarks to put this again, as I said, in a historical context. I think the problem we're facing today goes back to the 1980s, when the federal government made a purposeful decision to ask or to want industry to increase its investment in research in the area of health. And in fact, what happened is there was a negotiation in terms of issues around patent protection if the pharmaceutical industry would commit to at least invest 10% of its profits into Canadian-based research. We had the change with respect to patent protection. We have approximately 10% of their profit invested in industry-based research in Canada. But now we need to ask ourselves questions about what happens when over time we see that the percentage of the research funded by industry today is between 25 and 30%. Many of us will say that he who pays the piper calls the tune. And I think that's what I'm particularly worried about. What should be the appropriate percentage of government investment, i.e. your tax dollars, such that you can control the research agenda, you can control the research priorities, or how much do you hand over? Is a 25% investment okay, a 30%? If it gets up to 50%, do we start to worry? Again, I want to emphasize the most important point is who sets the research question. And I'm going to say to you there are many, many healthcare questions we should be asking and answering that have nothing to do with pharmaceuticals. It doesn't mean that pharmaceuticals aren't a very important part of our healthcare system. It's just to say that's not the solution for waiting lists. That's not the solution for our youth living on the street. That's not the solution for the elderly that have problems in the context of abuse in a healthcare setting.
30 seconds.
And so with those remarks, I'll end.
Thank you. Now, Chris MacDonald.
Okay, thanks. Private industry in Canada spends about $1.5 billion on health research every year, and about a quarter of that is spent on research conducted at universities. Many see this funding as a mixed blessing. To see why, it's worth starting by asking, what are the effects of markets overall? That is, what are markets and business corporations good at, and what are they not so good at? What markets are good at is aggregating information, promoting efficiency, and raising a society's standard of living. For their part, business corporations are good at aggregating human talents and financial resources in order to achieve more than those same talents and financial resources could achieve separately. But there are certain things that markets and corporations are less good at. First, they're much less good at sorting out the difference between wants and needs. So, for example, market forces have been pretty good at bringing us remedies for baldness and erectile dysfunction, but not so good at bringing us cures for rare, debilitating diseases. Second, markets and corporations are also poor mechanisms for achieving distributive justice. Markets are good at generating wealth, but there's no guarantee that everyone will benefit equally from the wealth generated, and nothing in the economists' efficiency equations guarantees that no one will be left behind. Finally, markets and corporations are relatively bad at sorting out what is good for society as a whole. Markets bring us what we, wisely or unwisely, demand. Markets are not reflective nor deliberative, and there is no guarantee that market outcomes will be wise ones. Now we start to see the reason why there is conflict between two very different sorts of institutions, private corporations and public universities, when they come into close association. Private corporations and public universities are quite different in their goals, their aptitudes, and their willingness to take on morally laden missions. The ambitions of a corporation typically, though not always, involve maximizing profit. The goals of a university, while themselves quite diverse, generally have something to do with promoting the social good by means of educating students and discovering new knowledge. So the worry whenever corporations provide funding to universities or to university researchers is that he who pays the piper will call the tune, individual research projects may be tainted, entire programs of research may be distorted, and ultimately the entire mission of the university may be corrupted. This worry raises two key questions. First, what are the pharmaceutical companies' obligations? And second, what can universities do to guard against the dangers? I think the main obligations of pharmaceutical companies are the obligations of other companies. Their main obligation, the main means by which they contribute socially, is to pursue profits through the combination of innovation and efficiency, constrained primarily by the law and by widely agreed upon moral rules. More specifically, they have an obligation not to do things that undermine the justification for their profit-seeking behavior. The thing that fundamentally justifies profit-seeking is the fact that profit-seeking behavior within certain boundaries is an essential component of a flourishing market economy. But when corporations do things that undermine the efficiency of markets, things like lying to customers, things like polluting excessively, they reduce the efficiency of the market and so undermine the only thing that gives them any justification for their profit-seeking behavior in the first place. Second, what can universities do? There are, of course, a range of procedures, policies, and mechanisms that universities can put in place to limit potentially corrosive effect of corporate money. One option, of course, would be to ban all funding from pharmaceutical companies. That certainly would solve the problem. It would also eliminate each year several $100 million of funding for Canadian health researchers. It's not realistic for many reasons, but it's worth pointing out that that's one end of a spectrum of solutions. I'd like to end by suggesting a mechanism aimed at reducing just one very specific kind of worry about corporate funding, just as an example of the kind of procedural mechanism we might make use of. The idea is this. Universities all have research ethics boards, REBs, whose role it is to scrutinize research projects involving human research subjects in order to ensure that the knowledge expected to be gained from the research is proportional to the risk, and to make sure that the research subjects understand the risks involved and understand that they're free to decline to participate. Current guidelines don't distinguish among research projects according to the source of their funding. That is, when a researcher brings a research project to the REB doesn't much care whether the research is funded by the federal government or a private charitable foundation or GlaxoSmithKline. But why not? We know, or at least we have reason to suspect, that pharmaceutical corporations are likely to push researchers to cut corners, to use fewer controls rather than more, and to rush to profitable conclusions faster than would otherwise be advisable. So why treat all sources of funding the same in this procedural way? I think that REBs should insist, for example, that researchers funded by pharmaceutical companies make use of even more rigorous processes of informed consent, and researchers accepting such funding should be required to be even more careful to safeguard the confidentiality of research subjects' personal information than they would otherwise be required. Things like that. Of course, this may already be happening informally. Many people on REBs probably mistrust the pharmaceutical industry and hence may be subjecting research projects funded by them to additional scrutiny. But it seems to me that it would make good sense for lots of reasons to make doing so a formal part of the process for reviewing research protocols with specific requirements applied consistently across universities and across REB members.
30 seconds.
Perfect. Now, I can slow down. Now, it is crucial to note that this proposal is not founded either in the belief that corporations are inherently unethical, or in a belief that any particular individual inside or outside the university or any particular company is especially likely to behave badly. It's simply rooted in the realities of different institutional goals, goals grounded to a large extent in legitimately different social roles. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. Glad we were able to let you have the big finish. Our next speaker is Donald Weaver. Donald?
Good evening. Well, health care and health research are extremely important components of our society. And because they're such important components of our society, I think that our approach to them has to be brutally pragmatic and practical. And if we're brutally pragmatic and practical, then we have to accept the fact that industry is an essential component of our health research system. And I emphasize that. I really believe that industry, and a healthy pharmaceutical industry, is absolutely essential to the well-being of our research system. Now, anybody who's been to their physician's office and has seen the physician flipping through the big blue book, the compendium, that contains over 1,000 different drugs that are in common clinical use, so that if you have a medical problem, the drug that you will probably be treated with is listed in that book. Every one of the drugs in that book, every drug that is in current widespread clinical use in Canada is there because industry has put it there. You can't get a drug onto market without industry. So our healthcare system is indeed dependent upon it. If one thinks of the processes that are necessary to go from bench to bedside, to take a drug and make it to where it counts, that is, in a patient, then that is a very long and arduous process. There's a lot of preclinical research that goes into it, and then there are the stages of clinical development, the phase 1, the phase 2, the phase 3 clinical trials, which ultimately are going to cost in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. That is high risk, very difficult venture to undertake, and because of that, it takes a very specific component of our society to address that, and that is the industrial component. The groups that have what it takes to take a molecule and put it through all those necessary steps to get it approved in multiple countries. So clearly, industry is very important in the overall research process. Now, when I say industry, I want to also make it clear that industry is a very heterogeneous group. Certainly, I think a lot of people in this room, when they hear industry, think big pharma. And big pharma is just one component of the healthcare industry out there. There's lots of small biotechs, there's lots of smaller pharma companies, there's even micropharma, as they're sometimes referred to. And if we collectively look at all these industrial pursuits, then they really are taking on a wide range of research activities across the country and contributing substantially to the healthcare within this country. Now, the issue of the relationship between universities and industry is always a difficult one, but I certainly believe that there is a huge and important role for industrial funding and industry within universities. The goal of health research, if one is looking at developing therapeutics for a disease, is not necessarily to publish a paper. The goal is to get a drug that makes it. And as best as possible makes it all the way to the people who have the disorders. So that is a long task in order to achieve that. And within the pure university environment, that is exceptionally difficult. The last drug that was purely developed within a university was warfarin, with the WA and warfarin standing for Wisconsin alumni, so you know who paid for the development of the drug. And since that time, there hasn't been a lot of drug development that's gone all the way from the university laboratory to industry. So they are an essential component. And because of that, I think that it is absolutely mandatory that we appreciate that both the university and the industry are essential, and that industry is essential, and having them involved really is an important component of how we effectively do healthcare research in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weaver. And finally, Jocelyn Downie.
Good evening. Well, Don gets to sing the praises of industry, and I get assigned the role of Chicken Little. The sky is falling, the sky is falling. I'm going to talk a bit about the concerns associated with the increased emphasis on commercialization of research in public institutions. I think we need to look at the effects on research itself, on education, on the health and safety of Canadians, and on society more broadly. So first, with respect to research, when you increase the emphasis on commercialization, you can see that you can increase the cost of research. The more you patent things, the more it costs to do the research that flows on from the patented materials. You can waste research dollars, research resources, human resources as well as financial ones, because you can have people have to repeat the work of others, because with all the secrecy that surrounds the commercialized research, you don't know that somebody else is doing the work, so you carry on and have to do it. You can also delay the advancement of knowledge. Again, the secrecy that comes with the patenting piece, which comes with the requirement to commercialize your research, means that we don't know, we don't share, and in not sharing we can delay the advancement of knowledge. And you can actually see the blocking of the advancement of knowledge, the complete blocking, not just slowing down, but you bury information. Because if it doesn't serve your interests, your financial interests, your commercial interests, you bury it deep. We also see that the emphasis on commercialization can shape what research gets done. That's already been alluded to today, where you see that you will do the research where there's a profit potential, which means you don't do research into orphan drugs, things that are orphan diseases, drugs that are going to treat a very tiny group of the population, or a massive population, but they have no money, so the poor. And you also don't see the emphasis on non-pharma research. It also shapes how research gets done, because the methods get designed to give you positive results. Because you want positive results if you're going to want to, A, get your drug licensed, and B, sell your drug. And you can actually shape your results by what kinds of questions you do, what tests you do in the context of your research. It also shapes how research gets reported. So you bury the negative results. If something shows that your drug doesn't work, get rid of that trial, don't be publishing that. We also see a phenomena of ghost authorship, where you have industry staff writing papers and then finding an academic to put their name on the paper and publishing it in a journal. Some of these practices have been diminished in recent years, but these are all the kinds of concerns that come up in the context of commercialization. Commercialization also affects education, not just the research itself, and it's important that we talk about that when we're sitting here in a university. It can reduce the free flow of ideas. If you're concerned about somebody taking your idea and commercializing it and getting profit from it, you won't share. And if a university is not the place for sharing knowledge, where is? You also have the delay of student publications and thesis approvals, because if you have a confidentiality clause in your contract, if the student is working under an academic who has a contract with industry and there's a confidentiality clause in that contract, the student can't publish their paper, the student can't publish their thesis until the company says it's okay to go, and you can have lags built in to those. You can also see a reduction in the trust between students amongst themselves and between students and their supervisors. Again, when profit gets involved, you can see the erosion in the relationships. You also see a shaping of the student research activities, because you're more likely to be engaging in thesis topics and so on, where, again, there's a profit potential, in part because you can see it for yourself, but also because your profs are being pushed by their universities to be involved in commercializable research, and so that's what they're going to want you working in. It's also going to affect what you can afford to work on. So your research topic gets shaped by whether there are patents on the things that you need to use in order to do your research. You may just not be able to afford to do the research. Shapes the curricula. We now see new degrees coming online. Degree at Waterloo, for example, in business, entrepreneurship, and technology. We're seeing commercialization right in the very curriculum. It shapes the profile and the activity of the educators who are seen and set up as being successful in the universities are very often the ones who are maximizing profit, doing highly commercializable research, not the other kinds of research, and that shapes your environment. It also shapes your space. It's funny to say it in here because this is a beautiful teaching space, but we have definitely seen a shift in what universities are spending their dollars on, their space dollars on, to labs where you can do commercializable research, not to nice classrooms for classic students. And that's a very important effect on the university environment. We also see implications for health and safety. You can have an increase in the risks to research participants. So for example, if research participants are not told of the risks that become known during the course of a trial, and this is a real example, they are put at greater risk. You have an increase in risk to the downstream users of the research results, because what I talked about before, if you bury certain negative results, but the drug gets licensed, people then get harmed when the risks are realized. So I just need to say Vioxx, and most people in the room will know, oh yeah, that's right, one of those drugs had to get pulled because it ended up hurting a lot of people.
15 seconds.
15 seconds, okay. Those are what seem like theoretical risks, and I want to leave you with just a few case names that for those of you who recognize the different ones, you'll get a sense of what's up. Because the point is that these theoretical risks do manifest themselves in real cases in the real world. Nancy Oliveri and Apotex, company threatened to sue her if she disclosed risks. Healy and CAMH, industry effectively got a psychiatrist to lose his job because he was critical of drugs. HPV and Merck. Merck had huge links into the Prime Minister's office and got a $300 million vaccine strategy put forward for their drug. And Pfizer, coming back around full circle to Francoise's start, Pfizer with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Governing Council and with the Canadian Medical Association, CME, were there again with significant problems.
Thank you very much. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to open it to each of the panelists who have 3 minutes each to comment on something that may have emerged as a theme in this discussion.
I agree with something that Dawn says, and it's actually something that's really important, which is that it's very expensive to get a drug to market. In fact, the cost of the drug, 65% of it is in clinical trials. And then beyond that, you've got the cost of patent, you've got the cost to market, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very expensive. I don't dispute that. What I want to call into question is where that money should come from. What I think you need to understand is the total healthcare spending in this country right now is $172 billion a year. Okay? That's what we as Canadians are spending on our healthcare system in a variety of ways. What you need to ask yourself is how much of that should be invested in research and development. There isn't a single company, whether I take Magna or Toyota or 3M, that doesn't know that if it wants to have a successful business, it has to invest in research and development. Our government right now at the federal level invests less than $1 billion in healthcare research. That's not 1%. Our government should be paying for some of those clinical trials such that it can control the direction of the research. It can help to set the priorities. So I don't want to dispute the cost, that it's the cost of the research. I don't want to dispute the fact that pharmaceuticals are a very important part of our healthcare system. I just want us to start asking questions about where we should put our own money. And I think it's really, really important to support, Dawn, with federal dollars, with your tax dollars, not to rely on industry which has a different set of interests, and I'm going to keep coming back to it. Their job, for those of you who have shares, is to make sure that you get a return on your investment. And the important thing to realize is what makes for a very successful commercial product may not make the best or the most sense in terms of healthcare or healthcare systems. You can have a Bafo drug, makes a lot of money, and it doesn't help the patient. You can have a Me Too drug. It's very successful commercially, but it hurts your healthcare system because it's driven up the cost of your healthcare. And that's the point that we need to really emphasize here. We need to do research and development into pharmaceuticals, but into a whole host of things, and we need to have control over which questions get asked, and we can only do that if we put our money there.
Thank you, Francoise. Wells, Chris?
Yeah. Just a couple of words that sort of start from something Dawn said and then go over to something Jocelyn said. And that was actually just a kind of an incidental point Dawn made about how not all pharmaceutical companies are the same, right? We tend to think of the big ones, right? And we forget, and I think it's actually kind of unfair to the huge majority of people, and I don't think anybody here intends that, but when you think of the vast majority of people who are working in like these little startup pharma companies that really just want to make the world a better place and are trying to do something good, and they, incidentally, I do it too, we end up sort of treating them as if they all have done the same things. I mean, the biggest players are starting to, I mean, it would be funny if it weren't so sad that they're starting to look like, criminal organizations with research branches. I mean, some of them have acted so badly, so repeatedly. But the thing about those big cases, right, is that you don't want to be misled by them any more than you're misled by the footage of airplanes crashing, right? You can name, and this is sort of where I'm going to pick on Jocelyn's bit a little bit. You can name hundreds of different ways to die on an airplane, right? You can name problems, if you name all the problems that have ever gone wrong on an airplane, it makes airplane travel sound really dangerous, where it's actually really safe. So you need to do a little bit more than just name kinds of problems that have happened. We need to know a little bit more about the incidence rate. And I think at some of the big companies, the incidence rate looks really lousy. But to figure out whether the overall system is a good system or not, we need a little bit more information than just sort of a list of past crimes.
Thank you, Chris. Dr. Weaver.
Where to begin? I disagree with pretty much all of you, but anyway. And once again, I have the feeling that's my role. So I have a recurrent theme: industry good. So where is it said that profit is bad? A number of individuals said, the goal of pharmaceutical industry is profit. And that's a partial definition. The goal of the pharmaceutical industry is to turn a profit by producing safe products. The pharmaceutical industry is a patient industry. This isn't the IT industry where you turn a profit in the short term. Pharmaceutical industry requires patient capital, long-term capital. And your shareholders want you to be around for a while. If you turn out unsafe compounds, then you're not going to be around for a while. And so it's still in their best interest to do as much as they can to produce safe and efficacious, useful drugs that'll be useful in the long term. And so it's not just a profit, it's turning out good products that will ultimately turn a profit. Now, the next thing is, well, who should be doing all of this? And then this raises the issue of government versus industry. Right now, we're having a problem with medical isotopes. And perhaps if medical isotopes was run by industry, we wouldn't have a shortage. I don't know, but it sounded good. I have to diffuse Jocelyn here somehow. She was going to jump on that. I could just feel it. So I think that the problem with government is that they go to the electorate every 4 to 5 years, and therefore their involvement in healthcare can be directed by that. A pharmaceutical company that may be looking at a 10-year mandate doesn't have that particular issue to deal with. And so you may think this is paradoxical, but I think in the long term, they're probably looking out for your interest just as much as anybody else. Just my final comment is that also, when we have these examples cited, remember that the pharmaceutical industry is dynamic. It changes. It learns from past errors, and rules and regulations change. It's a heavily regulated industry, and so mistakes that were made a decade or 2 decades ago hopefully are not going to be made again. And so we can cite examples, but many of these are historical examples. Thank you.
That was the wrong thing to say, Don.
Oh, yeah.
Jocelyn.
Well, I was told to get it going, so. Geez, I'm laying it here for you.
Not by me.
Okay. So the issue of raising examples has come up a couple of times so far. And there's a couple of reasons to do it. And I would have given much more detail if Costas hadn't been waving his hands around at me. We were given 5 minutes to start. You can't give all the stories because they're actually quite complex to give. But the thing is, the point is not, here are all of these cases and that's your knockdown so you don't do it. It's to say we've had cases come up. There are concerns that we can raise about all these different effects. And what they show is that we need to be careful. We can't do the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil routine that the government has done and the universities have been complicit in terms of the effects and the potential risks, the potential harms of commercialization. I'm not saying don't commercialize. I'm saying pay attention to what the possible effects, brainstorm, what could they all be? And then think through, is there any evidence that in fact we're seeing them? Oh yes, in fact there is. We don't know the incidence. We can't know the incidence because, for one thing, these things are incredibly secretive. Try and do a study involving a research ethics board and you will see what I mean. You cannot get the data. But there's enough to say we need to do it carefully. If you can project a potential risk, why not put in place a system that will prevent that risk from materializing? So that's why you need to think about the potential effects and then work to prevent them, as I say. The thing about a heavily regulated industry, it is an incredibly ineffectively regulated industry. We have a broken system for the oversight of research involving humans. So it's regulated at the level of, are the plants clean? And the production side of things, I'd grant that that's actually more effectively regulated than the research involving humans, the drug trials, because the research ethics system is broken. So I can't take comfort in that. And then the final comment is that these are historical examples. Well, no. The Pfizer CIHR Governing Council, the Pfizer announcement of the Canadian Medical Association Partnership for Continuing Medical Education, that's this past fall. So these are right here, right now. We have the Vice President of Pfizer having been appointed to the Governing Council of CIHR. We have the Pfizer pairing with the CMA for CME, and this is a company that a month before this vice president was appointed to the Governing Council, had faced the largest criminal fraud settlement in United States history, and not just for drug problems cases, this is for all criminal fraud, a $2.3 billion settlement, including admitting to criminal fraudulent behavior with respect to continuing medical education. So CMA just partnered with the only company that's been found guilty of criminal fraud in relation to continuing medical education. So it's right now, it's with us. We're not regulating it well enough. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying we have to do a much better job at doing it and think through the implications of what we're doing.
Thank you, Jocelyn Downie. In a moment, if anyone would care to, we'll take questions from the floor. Just until someone gets to the microphone, I want to throw out one question. This is the quick snapper. You can all participate in this. Markets are good at conveying information about what people want rather than what they need. Who should determine what health products are needed? Anyone care to respond to that?
I mean, I think that, I assume that part of that question is looking at the difference between needs and wants. And I recognize that there are many things that perhaps patients, when they're seen as consumers, we tend to then think that, if that's what they choose to purchase, that they ought to be able to do that. But I think in this context, when you have a government-funded healthcare system, you do have certain measures in place to try to determine what is it that's legitimate in the context of the pursuit of health and well-being. And then what we do is we have different understandings of what's going to constitute health and well-being. And one of the things that I actually find quite interesting in the context of the use of pharmaceuticals is that I actually, in my other life, my day job, amongst other things, study questions around identity. And one of the things I find quite fascinating is the use of drugs to, in fact, change one's identity, either in a purposeful context around depression or in a hallucinatory context. Have I given you enough material there, Don?
Thanks. I love the lead-in saying hallucinatory. Anyway, no, I agree that the role of government is there to ensure that products on the market are safe and are not going to do harm. However, the role of industry is to provide products, and in the healthcare system, the individual with the disorder, the patient, the client, whatever, certainly is an active participant in that. And they should have a say on what they want to swallow and what they want to take. It's up to a profitable company to try to predict what individuals will want and to provide that product. And if the patients out there don't want to swallow that product, they're not going to, and the industry's not going to have a product. And so as to who decides who does what, I think it's rather complex, and I will admit that industry does shape market and people shape market. It's a very complex issue. But I don't think that the role of the individual can be neglected, and that the patient has a say in what they want to swallow, and it should be industry should be able to try to predict that and provide the necessary agents. Chris
MacDonald, Jocelyn, Downie?
Just a really brief thing to say. I mean, part of this, what this question points to is that, you know, for all kinds of consumer goods, we're kind of agnostic about how much of them should be produced and what, you know, do we need more manufacturers of chairs or do we need more manufacturers of tables? We mostly say, well, people will buy as many as they buy and companies will start up to meet the supply, to meet the demand. And pharmaceuticals are presumably in a different, or at least some pharmaceuticals are in a different category, right? Where we don't want to say, look, you just leave it up to everybody's perceptions of what they think they need. We probably want to have a little more direction about, you know, we want to have something called health policy, where we don't need to have something called chair policy, right? We can just sort of leave that up to the market. So I think what we want to be able to do is figure out, and it's really hard to do, figure out sort of which segments of the pharmaceutical market probably could just be left to more or less free market forces versus which ones we want to try and use various policy instruments, whether they're regulatory or funding mechanisms, to have more influence on what actually does get provided.
Just very quickly, I think there's an entity that hasn't been talked about because we talked about industry and government, and I think there's a role here for universities. I think we've lost sight of our mission, and in part that's because of the push for commercialization and the cuts in funding. But the universities have to respond to the needs of the public, especially the vulnerable, and pursue those through their research. We're a public institution. We should be serving the public interest, and we have a role in answering exactly your question.
Okay, now I'd like to open the floor to those of you in the audience who care to pose a question to our panelists or make a brief statement.
My basic question is, why bother with the drug industry? We've had this industry going for probably since World War II, and we have poured literally hundreds of billions of dollars into it, and we have a wonderful stock already of well-developed drugs that cater to a very small group, I suspect, in the general population. Most of us are healthy and lead healthy lifestyles and do all the running and eating the right foods and so on, which we should really be investing our money in my opinion, as a public health concern, not in drugs, which are just sort of, I think they have a purpose, but we already have them. Why do we have to continue to pour enormous amounts of money to develop drugs that we already have, or slight modifications that might benefit 3% or 0.25% from somewhere? Thank you.
That's a good question, and I certainly agree with you that research into promotion of a healthy lifestyle is important, and that certainly if one dealt with obesity and a lot of the other healthcare issues, then that would have a far greater impact on health. I mean, certainly if you look at improvements in health over the last 200 years, probably civil engineering has done more for health than medicine, with control of water and wastewater. And so there are lots of public health issues that are extremely important. That having been said, I don't think we have a whole lot of good drugs. We have a whole lot of drugs, but there is a lot of room for improvement out there. Certainly in the area of antibiotics, the microorganisms that are out there are starting to increasingly get around the drugs that we have, and so there is needs for new approaches to that. If you look at the drugs that are available for, say, Alzheimer's disease, the drugs that are available are more symptomatic than actually affecting the disease. And I think that as research from universities improves how we think about certain diseases, that the role of the pharmaceutical industry is to take that and translate it into improved medications. So I will agree with you that healthcare, public health issues are important. I won't agree with you on the issue of we've got a lot of good pills. We have some good pills, but there is definitely a need for the continued development of other ones.
Jocelyn?
A quick twist on your question, which is sort of why should we do it? I think before we can answer that, we have to look at why we are doing it. And one of the things that's important for the audience to be aware of, if people don't know yet, is that there's a phenomenon of the commercialization of research in the